There is a strange cruelty in watching old comedy. The faces remain young, the jokes arrive on cue, the room fills with laughter exactly where it did half a century ago, nothing on the screen appears to age, and then you remember that the man making you laugh never had the chance to grow old. For millions of viewers, James Beck will always be Private Joe Walker of Dad's Army, the sharp-suited Cockney Spiv with a cigarette never far from his hand, a deal always somewhere in the background, and an answer ready before Captain Mannering had finished asking the question. Walker was the man who could find whisky when there was none, silk stockings when shops were empty, and almost anything else if the price was right. He was younger than most of the platoon, quicker than almost all of them, and just dishonest enough to be useful. Yet the actor behind him was only beginning to discover how far he might go. By the summer of 1973, James Beck had become much more than a supporting face in Britain's favourite Home Guard platoon. He was leading another television comedy. He had worked in drama, theatre, and film. A new pilot with Arthur Lowe had been recorded. At 44, the career that had taken him years to build was finally opening up. And then, within a matter of weeks, it was over. The irony was almost unbearable. Dad's Army was built around elderly men preparing for an invasion that never came. The first of its principal platoon to die was not one of the old veterans. It was James Beck, the man who seemed to have the most time left. This is the story of the difficult childhood, the unlikely journey into acting, the role that made him famous, the career he was trying to build beyond it, and the summer when British comedy lost one of its most naturally gifted character actors before anyone had seen what his second act might have been. This is James Beck. Stanley James Carroll Beck was born on the 21st of February 1929 in Islington, North London. The London into which he arrived was not the polished world of television studios and dressing rooms that would later become familiar. His childhood was lived much closer to the hard edges of working-class life. Money was often uncertain. Biographical accounts describe his father as struggling with periods of unemployment, while his mother helped keep the household going by making artificial flowers. It was not poverty turned into picturesque nostalgia. It was the ordinary anxiety of families who never had quite enough room between one week and the next. That background matters when we look at the character James Beck would later make famous. Joe Walker understood shortages. He understood that when official channels failed, another market appeared. He knew the value of what people could not easily obtain. He knew the rhythm of backstreets, small deals, sharp talk and survival. Beck did not simply arrive at Walker wearing a moustache and a suit. He had grown up in the London from which characters like Walker came. As a boy, he attended Popham Road Primary School. There was little to suggest that a national television career lay ahead. Beck did not emerge from a theatrical dynasty. There was no famous family name opening doors and no obvious route towards the stage. Instead, one of his first serious interests was art. He attended St. Martin's School of Art in London, an institution that would later become famous for producing generations of painters, designers, musicians, and performers. For Beck, it offered a possible future that was creative but not yet theatrical. Then came national service. Like thousands of young British men of his generation, Beck entered the army. He served as a physical training instructor, a role that demanded confidence, physical presence, and the ability to hold the attention of a group, qualities that would prove surprisingly useful when another profession eventually claimed him. After leaving the army, he tried commercial art. It should have been sensible. He had trained for it. It was respectable work. It offered something like security, and he appears to have disliked it. There is an oft-repeated story about the moment his life changed. Beck was travelling on a bus when he noticed a man reading a script. On impulse, he struck up a conversation and said that he would like to become an actor. The encounter supposedly led to work as an assistant stage manager with a small theatre company, and from there to walk-on parts and speaking roles. Whether every detail of that story survived retelling exactly as it happened is less important than what followed. James Beck did something reckless. He walked away from the sensible path. He chose the stage. There was no guarantee of fame waiting at the other end. In fact, for years there was barely a guarantee of employment. But the man who would later play television's most confident opportunist had made the biggest gamble of his own life. Acting careers often look inevitable when viewed backwards. A famous role appears, and everything that happened before it becomes a neat sequence of stepping stones. Living through those years is very different. For James Beck, the road was long, provincial, uncertain, and mostly invisible to the millions who would later know his face. He worked in repertory theatre, the demanding system in which actors could move rapidly from one production to another, sometimes learning a new role while still performing the previous one at night. Records place him with the Unicorn Players in Paignton during the mid-1950s, where he appeared in a succession of repertory productions including A Hand in Marriage, Little Lambs Eat Ivy and Pink String and Sealing Wax. His stage work later took him elsewhere. He appeared in The Queen and the Welshman at Hornchurch in 1958, and years later in The Mating Game in Bournemouth in 1971. Accounts of his career also credit him with roles as different as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice and Archie Rice in The Entertainer. That range tells us something important. Beck did not set out to become a television Spiv. He wanted to be an actor, a proper working actor who could move between Shakespeare, modern drama, comedy, and whatever else the next company placed on the rehearsal table. Repertory gave him something drama schools cannot manufacture: repetition under pressure, night after night, different audiences, different parts, no close-up to rescue a weak moment, and no second take if a line went wrong. By the beginning of the 1960s, television was expanding rapidly in Britain, and Beck began moving towards the medium that would finally transform his career. His screen credits came gradually. There was Dr. Finley's Casebook. There were appearances in police and crime dramas. He turned up in Coronation Street as Sergeant Bowden on several occasions between the mid-1960s and 1967. He appeared in The Troubleshooters. He played smaller parts that viewers might recognize without ever learning the actor's name. In 1968, he appeared in the BBC Sherlock Holmes series starring Peter Cushing in The Blue Carbuncle. Look at those credits now and a pattern emerges. Policemen, officials, working men, men from the street, the sort of parts British television required by the dozen. Beck was becoming reliable, but reliability is not the same thing as stardom. He had already spent years acting. He was approaching 40. He had the experience, the voice, the timing, and the face. What he did not yet have was the role. Then Jimmy Perry and David Croft began casting a new comedy about the Home Guard. Dad's Army did not look like an obvious revolution. Its premise was almost defiantly old-fashioned. A group of men in a fictional seaside town form a Home Guard platoon during the Second World War. Their enemy is Nazi Germany, but most weeks their real opponents are bureaucracy, bad luck, wounded pride, and one another. At the center was Captain George Mannering, the pompous bank manager convinced that history had finally supplied the crisis for which he had been preparing all his life. Around him came Sergeant Wilson, Corporal Jones, Fraser, Godfrey, Pike, and Private Joe Walker. Walker was different. He was younger. He was fit. He should probably have been somewhere else, and he could get things. Rationing and shortages had created a particular figure in wartime Britain, the Spiv. Smartly dressed, quick-talking and morally flexible, the Spiv lived in the space between what people were officially allowed and what they actually wanted. Jimmy Perry understood the type intimately. Walker was originally a part Perry himself had considered playing. Instead, James Beck got the role. Perry later praised what Beck brought to the character, the mixture of cheekiness and charm. That combination was essential. Play Walker too dishonestly, and the audience dislikes him. Play him too softly, and the character stops being Walker. Beck found the line. His Walker could sell something dubious in one scene and help the platoon out of genuine trouble in the next. Captain Mannering disapproved of him in principle and depended on him in practice. When the system failed, Walker usually knew another system. Need a bottle of whisky? Walker might know someone. Need a tire, a piece of equipment, a bit of material that officially did not exist. Give him a moment. His great comic weapon was not simply the dialogue, it was the attitude. Beck often played Walker as though he were watching the rest of the platoon from half a step ahead. Mannering might be announcing some elaborate plan while Walker's expression quietly suggested that he had already seen the flaw. He was not the loudest character. He did not need to be. The moustache, the narrow eyes, the easy grin, and the casual confidence did much of the work. Dad's Army first reached television screens in July 1968. Its success was not instantaneous, but it grew into something much larger than another BBC sitcom. At its height, audiences were counted in the many millions. The Platoon became part of British popular culture, and James Beck, after years of anonymous supporting work, suddenly had a character everyone recognized. There was only one problem. Success had given him the very thing actors spend years chasing, and now he had to make sure it did not become a cage. Joe Walker worked because he disturbed the balance of Dad's Army. Without him, the Platoon could easily have become a collection of eccentrics from an older Britain. Walker brought in another world. He was commerce in uniform, a reminder that while Captain Mannering talked about duty and discipline, ordinary people were still trying to find cigarettes, clothes, petrol, and whatever else wartime restrictions had made scarce. He also gave the writers a character who could solve impossible problems without obeying the rules. That was comedy gold. British Comedy Guide describes Walker as a black market trader who sees wartime scarcity as an opportunity, but also as fundamentally kind-hearted and repeatedly useful to the Platoon. That contradiction is the character. Walker breaks rules, but he is not a villain. He mocks Mannering, but he belongs to the group. He makes money from shortages, yet when the Platoon genuinely needs him, he is there. Beck understood that the affection had to sit underneath the cheek. The chemistry around him mattered too. Dad's Army was filled with performers who arrived with decades of experience. Arthur Lowe had the authority and insecurity needed for Mannering. John Le Mesurier could destroy a pompous speech with the gentlest hesitation. Clive Dunn turned panic into physical comedy. John Laurie could make a warning of doom sound like Shakespeare. Arnold Ridley brought genuine gentleness to Godfrey. Ian Lavender, much younger than most of the others, made Pike both foolish and lovable. Beck had to fit into that machine without disappearing inside it. He did. In an interview about the show's success, he credited not simply the writing but the team's spirit, the fact that the cast genuinely liked one another and worked well together. That warmth can be seen on screen. The Platoon argue constantly, but the comedy rarely becomes cruel. Walker teases Mannering because Mannering is impossible not to tease, yet there is usually loyalty beneath it, and Beck gave the series something else: speed. Listen to Walker beside Mannering or Jones. He sounds modern. His speech is faster, his instincts are faster, his relationship with authority is less deferential. He belongs to the London that would emerge after the war as much as the Britain the series was remembering. As Dad's Army grew, so did Walker. Beck appeared in the feature film version in 1971. The character survived call-up attempts, dubious deals, military exercises, and Mannering's suspicion. One episode even built its plot around the question that always hung over him: why was this healthy young man in the Home Guard rather than the regular army? Walker is called up. The Platoon tries to save him. He passes the medical, and then, with perfectly Dad's Army logic, he is returned because of an allergy to corned beef. It is ridiculous, and it works because by then the audience understood that Walmington-on-Sea without Walker would not feel quite right. But James Beck was beginning to ask a more serious version of the same question. What would his career look like without Walker? Typecasting is a peculiar form of success. An actor spends years hoping the public will remember him. Then one day they do, and suddenly he wonders whether they will ever allow him to be anyone else. Biographical accounts suggest Beck was conscious of that danger. He had spent too long building range in repertory theatre to be satisfied with playing one variation of the same Cockney operator for the rest of his career. So while Dad's Army continued, he kept working. He appeared in A Family at War. He took other television roles. He appeared in the 1970 film Groupie Girl. None of those roles displaced Walker in the public imagination, but they mattered to Beck because they proved he could exist beyond the church hall at Walmington. His private life remained far less public than his television persona. He had married Kay Bullis in 1959, before Dad's Army made him famous. There was no modern celebrity machine documenting every detail of the marriage, and Beck was not the kind of star whose domestic life filled newspapers. Work was what people saw, and increasingly, work was coming. The greatest sign came with Romany Jones. The series began with a pilot in 1972 and developed into an ITV sitcom centered on Bert and Betty Jones, a newly married couple living in a shabby caravan site. James Beck played Bert. This time he was not one member of a celebrated ensemble. He was the lead. Bert Jones still used some of the qualities audiences liked in Walker, the cheek, the schemes, the working-class wit, but the situation was different and the responsibility was greater. For an actor worried about being trapped by one successful character, Romany Jones was important. Television executives were not simply asking for Private Walker again, they were building another program around James Beck. He appeared in the 1972 pilot and 13 episodes across the first two series, 14 appearances in all, and the timing is crucial. By 1973, Beck was not a fading actor clinging to the one role people remembered. He was becoming busier. Dad's Army was still running. Romany Jones had given him another leading television role. And then there was Bun Clark with an E, an unbroadcast pilot made in 1973, starring Beck alongside Arthur Lowe and written by the legendary Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. The pilot was never developed into a series. But think about what it represented. James Beck was working with the writers behind Hancock and Steptoe and Son. He was being paired again with Arthur Lowe outside Dad's Army. Another door was opening. This is what makes the end of his story so painful. We do not have to invent a hypothetical great future for James Beck. The evidence of momentum is already there. Another sitcom, another pilot, more work. At 44, after years spent fighting his way from repertory theatre to national recognition, he had reached the point where the industry was beginning to ask what else he could do. He was finally getting the chance to answer. The summer of 1973 should have been one of the best periods of James Beck's life. He had work. He had recognition. He had two successful television identities, Walker in Dad's Army and Bert in Romany Jones, and other projects hovering around him. Dad's Army was preparing another series. The cast had been together for 5 years and the program had become an institution. On location, Beck was still Walker. The suit, the moustache, the look that suggested a deal was being arranged somewhere just outside the frame. Nothing in those surviving images announces that the end is near. That is what makes them difficult to watch now. On Friday the 13th of July, Beck recorded radio material with his Dad's Army colleagues at the Playhouse Theatre in London. The next day, while attending a summer fete connected with guide dogs for the blind, he became seriously ill. He returned home. Within a short time, he was taken to Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton. The diagnosis was pancreatitis. This was not a minor interruption that could be solved by rearranging a recording schedule. His condition was grave. Production on Dad's Army faced an immediate practical problem. Location material had already been filmed for parts of the new series, but studio work remained. The show had lost actors temporarily before. Illness could be written around. Schedules could be changed. Everyone expected, or at least hoped, that James Beck would come back. He did not. His illness led to severe complications. On the 6th of August, 1973, James Beck died. He was 44 years old. The first of the principal Dad's Army platoon to die was the man who had looked as though he should outlive nearly all of them. Arthur Lowe was 57, John Le Mesurier was 61, John Laurie was 76, Arnold Ridley was 77, yet it was Beck, the quick young Spiv standing among the veterans, whose place became empty first. The shock went far beyond the practical problem of scripts and schedules. The cast had worked closely for years. Beck himself had spoken of their affection for one another. Now one of the team was simply gone. There was no long farewell, no final planned episode, no retirement storyline, No chance to let Walker walk out of the church hall and into another life. Real life had interrupted the comedy with a brutality no writer would have chosen. There was one final cruelty in the timing of James Beck's death. His career did not stop appearing on screen when his life stopped. Only 20 days after Beck died, British cinemas opened Love Thy Neighbour, the feature film version of the popular television sitcom. Beck appeared as Cyril, a supporting role far removed from the Home Guard Hall at Walmington-on-Sea. It was not the performance that would define him, and it was never likely to replace Walker. But its timing gave it a significance nobody involved could have intended. Audiences buying a cinema ticket on the 26th of August, 1973, were watching a new James Beck performance. Yet the actor they were watching had already been dead for nearly 3 weeks, and the strange experience was about to repeat itself on television. Romany Jones had already proved that Beck could carry another comedy away from Dad's Army. Its first series had been transmitted while he was alive, but the second series did not begin broadcasting until the 14th of September, more than a month after his death. Week after week, viewers could still see Beck as Bert Jones, scheming, arguing and joking as though nothing had happened. For anyone who knew the truth, there was something unsettling about it. The career appeared to be continuing after the man had gone. A new film in the cinemas, another series on television, Dad's Army episodes still waiting to be shown. For a brief period in late 1973, James Beck seemed to be everywhere at precisely the moment when he could no longer enjoy any of it. That matters because it changes the way we look at his final year. This was not a performer who had quietly disappeared before his death. His work was still arriving, producers were still casting him, audiences were still discovering him in new material. The evidence of a career moving forward was appearing on British screens after the future itself had already been taken away. It is easy, with hindsight, to see every final appearance as a farewell. But Beck did not make these performances as farewells. There was no final bow in his mind. No carefully chosen last role, no sense that the camera was recording the end. He was simply working. And until July 1973, there was every reason to believe he would keep working for many years to come. Television has an eerie way of preserving time out of order. By the time viewers watched James Beck in the 6th series of Dad's Army in the autumn of 1973, the actor had already died. Episode after episode, Walker appeared alive on screen, selling, scheming, smiling. The audience knew something the character did not. One of the most famous episodes of the entire series, The Deadly Attachment, remembered for the captured U-boat crew and the immortal exchange involving Pike's name, was broadcast in October 1973, more than 2 months after Beck's death. War scenes that were recorded after he became ill. Watch without knowing the production history, and the episode simply feels like another piece of Dad's Army. Know the history, and the seams become visible. A man is present because one part of television was filmed earlier, then absent because another part was filmed later. The fiction tries to remain whole while reality has broken through it. The following episode, The Recruit, became the first not to feature Beck as Walker, although his name remained in the credits. Within the story, Walker's absence was handled in character. A note explains that he has gone up to London to do a deal. It is exactly the sort of excuse Walker would make, and because of that, it hurts more. There is no grand speech, no solemn music, no announcement that a beloved member of the platoon will never return, just business. Walker has gone to do a deal. Then the series moves on. Writers Jimmy Perry and David Croft chose not to recast him. A later character could occupy space in the platoon, but nobody could simply become Joe Walker. The program continued until 1977. It remained popular, it remained funny, but something in its chemistry had changed. Walker had supplied a particular energy, younger, sharper, less obedient, less sentimental. Once gone, that ingredient could not be replaced by copying it. James Beck had made the character too specifically his own. The easiest way to tell James Beck's story is as a tragedy. Young actor becomes famous. Young actor dies. End. But that misses what makes the loss significant. James Beck was not a child star whose career had already burned through its possibilities, nor was he a veteran whose great work lay safely behind him. He died at the exact point where one successful part was beginning to become a career. Romany Jones makes that clear. After Beck's death, the program did not simply continue unchanged. His Burt Jones and Joe Rowbottom's Betty were replaced from the third series by another couple. The show survived, but the vehicle that had been built around Beck had lost the man at its center. Then there was Bun Clark with an E, one pilot, Arthur Lowe and James Beck, Galton and Simpson scripts. It was made, but never publicly broadcast and never developed into the series it might have become. Another road ending before anyone knew where it led. That is the temptation when discussing an actor who dies young, to imagine masterpieces that were never made, awards never won, characters never created. We should resist that. There is no way to know whether James Beck would have become one of Britain's great dramatic actors, a permanent sitcom lead, a familiar character performer, or something entirely different. But we do know this. He had range before Walker. He kept working outside Walker. He had become the lead in another sitcom. He had recorded another pilot. He was wanted. The future was not an empty fantasy. It had already started. And perhaps that is why the familiar photographs of Beck are so deceptive. Private Walker looks complete, perfectly formed, a character who requires nothing else. James Beck was not complete. At 44, he was still becoming. The public had finally learned his face. The industry was beginning to learn his range. And then there was no more time. James Beck was cremated at Putney Vale in London. There would be no new series built around him, no late career interview looking back on Dad's Army, no memoir explaining what he really thought about Walker, Arthur Lowe, John Le Mesurier, the lost episodes, the fame, the typecasting, or the strange experience of seeing a television character outlive the actor who created him. What remains is the work. And, above all, Walker. Dad's Army itself became far larger than anyone involved in its first series could have expected. Decades after its original run, it continued to be repeated, restored, discussed, and rediscovered. New generations met Captain Mannering. They heard Jones panic. They watched Wilson question whether something was wise. They saw Pike make another mistake. And somewhere nearby, Walker was doing business. That is the paradox of James Beck. His life was short. His most famous character became almost indestructible. A performance recorded in the late 1960s and early 70s still arrives fresh each time somebody watches it for the first time. The cigarette is still there. The moustache is still there. The grin still knows something Mannering does not. And the timing remains beautifully alive. It is tempting to measure actors by the number of years they worked, the awards they collected, or the size of the filmography left behind. James Beck did not get the years. He did not get the long second half of the career. He did not get to become the elderly guest on television programs remembering the golden age of British comedy. He got something smaller, and perhaps rarer. One character that fitted him so completely that more than half a century later, it is difficult to imagine anybody else standing in that place. Private Joe Walker was a man who always seemed able to obtain what everyone else could not. A bottle, a tire, a uniform, a favor, a deal. But there was one thing neither Walker nor James Beck could bargain for. More time. James Beck was 44 when he died. For the audience, he never really left Walmington on Sea. He is still there whenever the episode begins again. Still young, still sharp, still waiting for Captain Mannering to need something he officially disapproves of. And perhaps that is why the loss still feels strangely unfinished, because James Beck did not leave behind the story of a career that reached its natural final curtain. He left behind the opening act of another one. The second act simply never came. If you found this documentary on James Beck enjoyable, consider subscribing to the Cinema Peak channel for more stories like this. Your support truly means a lot. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.